Hello everybody and welcome to another middle game video. We'll be exploring plans in the middle game from the Grunfeld defence. So the sample game I have for you is a game played in 2015 at the British Championships. Somewhere I was actually, and pity I didn't get to see this game. It was between Marcus Osborne, who was white, and who I actually played later. He's about 2,200 FIDE, and Jonathan Hawkins, who is a very strong Grandmaster. I think in the mid 2500s, but he might be more than that now. Anyway, Jonathan Hawkins was black, and he decided to play the Grunfeld. So the game started d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and now we have the Grunfeld with d5. So I've done a video on the opening of the Grunfeld, going through some of the sideline variations and black's general plan, as well as how white could counter black's ideas. But instead of a sideline, we get the main thing with c takes d5, knight takes d5, e4, so white establishes a centre, knight takes, pawn takes. And after bishop g7, which is one of the main moves, the other being c5, white has quite a lot of choices. In my opening video, I covered bishop c4, bishop e2, bishop e3, and knight f3. They're the three most common moves, but Marcus Osborne shows a fourth option, queen a4 check. So it still defends d4, which becomes the square that both sides fight over. And it might possibly disrupt black's development just a little. So the two moves played generally are queen d7, which is quite challenging, but according to theory, maybe slightly inferior to the move Jonathan played, which is knight d7. So here, black isn't really attacking d4 anymore. Also notice that knight c6 would lose to d5 oh no, wait, it wouldn't. No, it wouldn't actually, no. Knight c6 still isn't very good because bishop d2 threatening d5 might not be that good for black. So knight d7 is apparently best according to opening theory. It also blocks in the pawn if you play knight c6. The c7 pawn can't move out to c5, which is a general theme attacking d4. So knight f3 was played, castles, bishop g5. So that threatens e7, so it possibly ties down the black queen to d8. So later on, the queen wouldn't be able to take on d4 or otherwise pressurize the center due to the e7 defense the queen is having to do here. c5 is now played, very thematic. And queen a3 is played. So it's now pressurizing black's pawn on c5, and also the queen is lining up to e7. So if black plays pawn takes d4, bishop takes e7 could be a very strong response from white. Instead, the bishop is kicked with h6, and it goes to e3, again defending d4. b6. The knight on d7, there's no point maneuvering it a lot, otherwise you'll be very far behind in development. So the bishop on c8 needs to develop along the long diagonal instead of going to g4. Rook d1, queen c7. So just getting the queen off the same line as the rook, as tactics can often occur and very unpleasant for the side with the queen. Bishop d3, bishop b7, and now here white has an interesting choice. there's castling as the quiet option, but there are two pawn pushes which are quite interesting to look at. One is e5, so creating a pawn chain and trying to shut out black's dark squared bishop, and that way it will lighten the pressure on d4. But on the downside, it allows the bishop on b7 to have more influence. So black will probably play e6 to tie down the white pawns and make them rather fixed. And black here has quite a nice pawn structure too, so black can still try and target d4 by putting the rooks on the d file, and the d pawn is backward at the moment, especially after black takes on d4 and white would have to recapture with the pawn. So black here would have the d5 square, which could be very pleasant. And if white does take, trying to just liquidate with the pawns, then knight takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, and now black is on e5, and there isn't really a satisfactory way to defend it. So castles and bishop takes e5 is a strong move, as well as bishop takes f3, going into an opposite coloured bishop middle game, but with black having the initiative. So e5 isn't that strong. Castling may be the best move, but Marcus chose d5. So this idea is to take away black's pressure from d4, and white is still controlling d4 enough with the pawn, the bishop, and the knight. However, what d5 does is it gives the square e5 for black's pieces. So knight e5, takes, takes, and I think the idea here was that white has two centre pawns, whereas black only has one. So white has more control at the centre and therefore is slightly better. I think that was the plan, but on the other hand, black's bishops look better than white's, and the queen is more centralised. So c4 was played just to bolster the d5 pawn, and now f5, which the computer doesn't really like, but I think it's very pragmatic. The best move is apparently taking the pawn on f5, but then after g takes, there's a nasty pin on the bishop on e3, so f4 is the threat, and f4 could be played anyway, as well as the move e6, which would almost force white to take it, and then the b7 bishop is bearing down on the king side. So instead, Marcus played f4, queen c3 check, bishop check, king e2. So white doesn't really need to castle at this point. And if I was black, I would have played f takes e4. But instead, there is a stronger move here, which is getting rid of the backward e-pawn with e6. Oops. So if white takes either pawn, it's really messing up the pawn structure. So rook c1 was played, just to show if d takes e6, then pawn takes e4, might be very annoying. And if e takes f5, then black could play e takes f5 as well as e takes d5, opening up the e file for the rooks. And there's also g takes f5 as well, and black would only be down a pawn after d takes e6 for a very short period of time. So white plays rook c1, and now f takes e4. So here there is again a choice. Bishop takes e4 and rook takes c3, but I think if rook takes c3, pawn takes, bishop check, rook takes, and then black could trade off the pawns, and white would have an isolated pawn on d5. Even though it's a passed pawn, I think black would get enough pressure to take it off. So bishop takes pawn, pawn takes, and again, if black just takes the bishop, if white takes the bishop, black can play pawn takes e4 with a strong protected passed pawn. So pawn takes was played. Now rook a e8, so not just passively defending, but instead creating threats. And king f3. So if bishop takes g6, there's quite a nasty idea of bishop d4 pinning the bishop. So if bishop takes rook, rook takes, and there's no way of defending the e3 bishop, so white will be down 2 bishops for a rook, which should be enough to win the game for black. So instead king f3 defends the bishops, and now the bishop drops back to e5. So again, it still is creating a lot of pressure against the white's position, against the white king in particular. So it's not just passively going back to g7, it's finding a way of making itself more useful. So h4 prevents g5, at least for the moment. King g7. So black's getting the king to a more active position here. Then g3. So it just is defending f4 for the time being. The bishop now does drop back to f6. So one way you could look at it is the bishop has gone back to sort of defend itself from any potential f takes e5s if the king moves away. But also it's opened up the e-file for the black rooks. And I'm not sure white handled the position quite as well as he could have done with g4. Now rook e7, so a doubling of rooks looks absolutely certain. And white now thinks that he can delay it with g5, but Jonathan Hawkins didn't hesitate. He didn't see any problems with his next move. He played rook f e8. So playing principled and doubling rooks. And here he has a very strong attack on both of white's bishops. So after takes, king takes, unfortunately rook d1 was played, which might be the best move. There are two big problems with rook c4. And the main one, in my opinion, is just rook takes bishop, rook takes, and then bishop takes d5, which would give black a good material advantage. But there's also b5 as well. And here the best line I could see was bishop takes c5, pawn takes rook, bishop takes rook, rook takes, rook takes. And again, there's some pressure from black, but I feel that this is a better continuation than the previous line. So instead, rook takes bishop is probably stronger. So instead, rook cd1 was played, and now rook takes bishop, and it's now very hard to see what white can do. Maybe rook h e1, but then king f5 as well as other moves could be extremely annoying for the white pieces. So the rook didn't move. The bishop moved instead to c1, getting out of the way. Rook a4. So the rooks are constantly targeting pieces and pawns. Rook h2. And rook e8 was played. So again, that d5 pawn, even though it's passed and is protected by the rook, it's not sufficiently guarded. The black pieces can converge on it. So after rook h d2, What do you think black played here? Rook takes d5. And after white picks up the rook, king e6. And the rook can't move due to the pin, so black can't defend it with anything else. Remember how bishops of opposite colours can be very useful in attacking, as their counterparts can't defend against the threats. So the white bishop can't be of any use, and the king can't come to e4 due to the rook on a4. So white had to settle for f5 check, takes, bishop takes. So white's trying to swap off pawns, and that's a good idea in general, because if white could, say, make 2 pawns on each side vanish, it would be very difficult to win, as in opposite colour bishops, usually the side who's down on material can sacrifice their bishop for both the pawns, and then it is a technical draw. But here, after check, king g3, rook takes, white's now down 3 pawns. And all those pawns on the queen side are connected, so they can roll up the board. And white's passed pawn is very hard to get moving, especially after h5, rook a3 check. And here, actually, Marcus Osborne resigned against Jonathan Hawkins, because after king h4, trying to shepherd the pawn, there's rook a4 check. And if you want to get mated in one move, king g5, rook g4 is checkmate, so the king has to move back. And now rook g4 check, bishop g2 just to get the king a little further away from the pawn, and bishop f3. So the bishop is going to take the pawn eventually. Again, the best, I say best line, but the only line I can see that doesn't lose more than this is rook f1, check, takes, 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 and 4 pawns up is easily enough to resign. So I think here Jonathan, being a grandmaster, would have been able to convert this without a lot of trouble. Anyway, I hope you found that game interesting, and it's a good illustration of what black plans to do in the middle game. Comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!